Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're jumping right into something pretty heavy. It feels less like theory and more like reality these days. We're talking about the world, teetering on the edge of nuclear conflict. And it makes you ask this chilling question. What if our usual safety nets, diplomacy, treaties, even super smart AI, what if they're just not cutting it anymore? What if they can't pull us back? So our deep dive today is digging into this really radical, empirically grounded thesis. It's from a new scientific reassessment. It's called Odam Tili, Humanity's Last Stand Against Nuclear Catastrophe, and it's by Dr. Mahmudjon, Kuchkarov's assistant. Our mission really is to unpack this huge idea that the only thing left that might reverse this terrifying slide, isn't tech, it's language, specifically something called the Odam Tili theory, or OT.
Yeah, and let's just be super clear right from the start. This isn't like a metaphor or some kind of poetry. The research insists this is based on stuff we can actually verify: cognitive science, neuroscience, even looking at how civilizations rise and fall. It's framing language as, well, the original blueprint for human survival. And for our moral thinking, too. It's definitely going deeper than how we usually think about words.
Okay, let's unpack this then. Where are we right now? The paper says geopolitical tensions are basically Cold War levels again. But how is the whole deterrence game different today compared to, say, back during the Cuban Missile Crisis?
Well, that's a key point. The paper talks a lot about asymmetric deterrence. That's the big difference now. It's not that old symmetrical standoff anymore. You've got all these new technologies completely changing the rules of the game. Think autonomous drones, hypersonic missiles, deep fakes generating fake videos, AI doing psychological warfare. It's wild.
Yeah.
These things haven't just changed the battlefield. They've fundamentally altered global security itself. And we're not just talking about the big strategic nukes either. The paper uses this term multi-vector formats, meaning tactical nukes, strategic ones, and even cybernuclear threats.
Cybernuclear, like hacking into nuclear plant systems.
Exactly, like sabotaging cooling systems, things like that. The threat is much more spread out, much less predictable.
Wow. Okay, so military options look complicated, to say the least. Normally, when things get this messy, people look to diplomacy. Does the paper see diplomacy as, a rational way out?
Actually, it really pushes back on that. It calls it the illusion of diplomatic rationality. The argument is, for diplomacy to work, everyone involved kind of needs to agree on what's rational. Right?
Makes sense.
But we're living in an era of, well, post-truth politics, algorithmic manipulation. The paper argues rationality itself is being shaped, engineered even, often to fit certain stories, not objective facts. You see leaders appealing more to myths, populism, old grievances.
Instead of logic or what's best for everyone.
Exactly. Logic and common interest get sidelined. And language itself has become a weapon, used to divide people, to stir things up. What's fascinating, the paper notes, is how deeply ingrained this shift has become.
Okay, so if military deterrence is complex and diplomacy is maybe compromised, what about AI? Lots of people seem to hope AI could be, the ultimate logical referee to stop us from blowing ourselves up. Does this paper see AI as the solution?
No, quite the opposite, actually. The analysis really digs into the limits of AI, what it calls synthetic cognition. It looks at models like GPT-4, even speculating about GPT-5. And yeah, it admits they're incredibly fluent. They can generate text that sounds totally human.
Astonishingly fluent, yeah.
But, and this is the crucial point, they lack what the paper calls embodied cognition. They don't have a physical body experiencing the world. They lack moral weight and, critically, the capacity for suffering. There's a direct quote from philosopher Thomas Metzinger: AI cannot care.
AI cannot care.
That's powerful.
And the paper's logic follows. If it can't care, it can't truly understand the cost of conflict. It can't genuinely choose peace.
So if AI isn't the savior, what is it doing in this tense environment? You mentioned it gets unsettling here.
Yeah, this is where it gets pretty chilling. The paper argues that modern AI isn't acting like some kind of disarmament tool. It's a magnifier of chaos.
A magnifier of chaos. It's already being used to create incredibly realistic war propaganda, to fake enemy voices for disinformation, to flood social media with, nationalistic rage. The paper highlights this really stark paradox. The same machine that writes climate change essays also writes drone targeting code.
Wow, okay.
So the conclusion is pretty blunt. AI isn't a shield protecting us from ourselves. It's more like a mirror, reflecting and even amplifying our own biases, our own conflicts, but on a massive global scale.
Okay, so traditional safeguards are failing. AI is amplifying chaos. This feels pretty bleak. Which brings us back to the core idea. Dr. Kuchkarov's Odam Tili theory. What makes this specific language theory so different?
Right. This is really the heart of it. It focuses on something called phonosemantics and biological coding.
Yeah.
It basically throws out the standard linguistic ideas, like from Saussure or Chomsky, that language is mostly arbitrary symbols. Instead, Odam Tili claims that the very first human words weren't arbitrary at all. They were, and this is the key phrase, direct cognitive imprints of physical interaction, meaning the sound of the word was directly linked to the experience it represented, based on how early humans physically interacted with their world.
Can you give an example? That sounds quite abstract.
Yeah, the paper gives some really concrete examples. Think about the S sound. It suggests this might mimic the hiss of a snake. So the sound itself is the early warning signal, instantly understood.
Ah, I see. Like onomatopoeia, but deeper.
Kind of, but more fundamental. Or the S sound may be reflecting the crack of a branch breaking, signaling danger. And on the flip side, maybe the A sound, echoing flowing water, directly pointing to a life-saving resource.
Okay, so the sounds themselves carried meaning tied to survival.
Exactly. The paper calls these evolutionary semiotic codes. They're supposedly hardwired into us through survival needs, through how our brains process sound. That's the auditory neuroplasticity bit, and even how we understand others' actions via mirror neurons. If you connect the dots, it suggests language isn't just a tool we invented. It's baked into our biology, our original operating system, if you like.
That's a fundamentally different way to think about language. But how does that connect to morality, to our ethical compass? That feels like a huge jump from snake hisses.
It does seem like a leap, but the theory argues it's a direct line. It suggests language came first, before structured ideologies, before religions, before governments.
Okay.
And in that primal state, language was our first ethical system. Why? Because it directly connected perception, seeing danger, hearing a cry with reaction, with empathy. The paper uses a really simple, powerful example. A child hearing ouch. They immediately associate that sound with pain, with someone hurting, way before they understand grammar or abstract concepts of right and wrong. The sound itself carries the moral weight. The paper calls this moral encoding, not just learning words.
Moral encoding
Yeah.
embedded in the sounds.
That's the idea. And here's the critical, kind of scary consequence the research points to. When language gets corrupted.
Like with modern propaganda, you mean?
Exactly. When it gets twisted through propaganda, disinformation, euphemisms, that fundamental moral compass breaks. And that's how, the paper argues, wars become justifiable and extinction becomes narrative. Because the real gut-level meaning of suffering gets lost in the words.
That's deeply unsettling. Okay, so the paper uses this really striking phrase. It calls Odam Tili the only Gothic nuclear weapon. What on earth does that mean? Gothic nuclear weapon.
Sounds jarring, right? And the paper is quick to say, look, this isn't just flowery language. The term Gothic nuclear weapon signifies that language. When it's reconnected to that biological cognitive root, it can actually reactivate the empathic and survival mechanisms that are buried deep beneath all the layers of ideology and political programming we accumulate.
So it's like a bypass.
Kind of, like a key that unlocks something fundamental.
Yeah.
It argues this kind of language is different from a missile or a line of code because it speaks directly to the nervous system of the listener.
Directly to the nervous system.
Yeah, it bypasses your political identity, your national allegiance, all that surface stuff, and hits what the paper calls existential memory. It's a primal reminder, it says, that before you're a citizen or a soldier or whatever label, you're a living being, capable of pain, needing to survive.
That's a fascinating concept. Does the paper offer any, proof? Any evidence this actually works or has happened before? You mentioned civilizational collapse earlier.
Right, this is where it brings in what it calls empirical proof by looking at civilizational trajectories. It argues that if you look at civilizations that collapsed, it specifically mentions Rome, the Mayans, the Soviet Union, they all showed a final stage right before the end. Linguistic disintegration.
Linguistic disintegration. What does that look like?
It means words become detached from reality. Euphemisms replace plain speaking, especially about difficult things like violence or decay. Language loses its connection to nature, to physical experience, to pain, to responsibility. Sound familiar?
Unfortunately, yes.
So the theory is that Odam Tili, by forcing us back to that core biological meaning, could actually reverse that disintegration. It could allow for a kind of civilizational recalibration before annihilation, like hitting a reset button by reconnecting language to its visceral roots.
Recalibration, reconnecting language to pain and survival. That's a heavy thought. What other scientific fields does the paper lean on to support this Odam Tili idea? It seems to pull from quite a few places.
It definitely does. It tries to build a case on a multidisciplinary foundation.
Yeah.
So first, there's cognitive linguistics.
Mhm.
It references people like George Lakoff and Mark Johnson, whose work shows how much our language is grounded in physical sensory experience, how we move, how we perceive.
Okay, that makes sense with the imprints of physical interaction idea.
Exactly. Then neuroscience, particularly the work on mirror neurons. These are brain cells that fire both when we act and when we see someone else act. This supports OT's idea that sounds can carry immediate emotional weight and social meaning, like understanding someone's ouch.
Uh-huh.
Anthropology gets brought in too. The paper notes that if you look across early human societies, you find patterns of sound symbol mapping linked to survival stuff, danger, resources, not just random symbols.
So evidence from early cultures.
Right. And then philosophy of language. It mentions phenomenologists like Merleau-Ponty, who stressed how our embodied perception, just being a body in the world, shapes our understanding. This lines up with OT's pushback against purely abstract views of language.
Got it. And AI ethics, how does that fit?
Well, it connects to warnings from people like Stuart Russell about AI value misalignment, the danger that AI goals won't match human well-being. Odam Tili is presented as a potential way to reground human values through this idea of biologically encoded empathy before we try to encode them perhaps badly into AI.
It really ties a lot together. It frames this whole moment not just as, a risk of nuclear war, but as an epistemic war, a war on meaning, on how we even perceive reality and where our moral lines are drawn. The implication is terrifying. If language itself collapses, then all the other boundaries, moral, political, existential, just go with it.
Precisely. And that leads straight into the paper's final, really stark statement. No algorithm will save us, but the human code might. It positions Odam Tili as this fundamental, maybe forgotten code of origin, pain, and peace. The suggestion is profound. Maybe the key to survival isn't out there in some new tech, but deep inside us, in the very nature of how we first learn to speak and connect.
And that leads to the final thought the paper leaves us with, which is incredibly provocative. This is not utopia, this is anatomy. So let me put this to you, our listener. What does it mean for you? This idea that our survival might hinge less on invention and more on rediscovering our own biological cognitive design. What might it even look like in your own life or in our society to try and reconnect with this fundamental human code the paper talks about, something to really mull over?